Hi guys, and welcome back to another video. This video is about a collection of speculative fiction that I finished a couple weeks ago. The name of the collection is Singa-Pura-Pura, Malay Speculative Fiction from Singapore, edited by Nazry Bahwari. So in this video, I wanted to cover a few different topics. First, I really want to set up some context because this collection does have both a foreword and an afterword that are more like essays, I guess, that I think are really helpful, especially for someone like me who is not Malay and not Singaporean. I think it really helps to contextualize kind of the intent of the anthology and also provide some background as to how we should approach the stories. And then secondly, I do want to give my thoughts on the short stories themselves. There are a few different themes that Bahwari has kind of organized the different short stories into. I think some of these short stories have been published before, but they've all been pulled together into this collection for the first time. And then finally, I did want to end off with a few of my thoughts, maybe some suggestions and some small critiques that I had. Okay, so in terms of context, I do think that the opening essay, which is called A Literary Movement from Down South, which is a foreword by Faisal Tehrani, was really interesting to kind of open up the collection with. So just to give you an overview, there are 4 kind of themes or groupings, and then within each grouping there are different short stories that kind of follow that theme, and then we're bookended with both a foreword and an afterword. So this foreword, I think, provides some good context because basically he's talking about the origins of Malay storytelling, speculative fiction, and I think really trying to tie this almost like lofty literary term, speculative fiction, to ancient storytelling and to a really long and rich historical legacy that has existed for a long time in Malay storytelling. And so what Faisal talks about is how there is both kind of like a lack of Malay voices in contemporary storytelling, while simultaneously that tradition of storytelling and myths being something that is universal. It's a really short foreword, but basically what he talks about is the Sejarah Melayu, which is the Malay annals, which I actually have. My very good friend Amira gifted this to me maybe my first or second year living in Singapore, and I regret to report that I still have not read it. But it will go on my to-be-read list this year. And essentially, so this is translated by Dr. John Layden, and I think that this is an edition from around the 1800s, the 19th century. But anyway, the Malay Annals are a romanticized history of the origin, evolution, and destruction of the Malacca Sultanate. And it was composed in the 17th century by court historians. That record was drawing on earlier accounts, so we don't really know like originally where it came from. It was more of like an oral storytelling tradition. And within the Malay Annals, you also have like the story of the rise of Singapore. The context here is kind of drawing a line from the Malay Annals to this body of work, saying that the place of Malays in Singaporean storytelling, culture, history, and modern day society is extremely important and integral, and kind of making the connection that kind of these long-standing historical acts of speculation and imagination and myth-telling began like in the 1700s from the Malay Annals. So I think that is a really interesting way to open up the collection, and I can see the intention really of promoting and underlining the importance of remembering where this whole like speculative fiction idea comes from, because it's not just like a modern literary movement. It's also something that our ancestors did and that has been going on for generations and for centuries, and especially within like the Malayu language and historical legacy has like very strong roots in this particular work as well. Okay, so then I think something that was really interesting to grapple with and really illuminating was actually the closing essay, which was by the editor, Mr. Bahwari, and I almost wish it had come first. I don't know, I kind of feel like the front end and the book end were more interesting than some of the stories themselves, or really projected this to be a very lofty project, and then I feel like kind of the varied quality of the short stories throughout didn't fully live up to the potential of what was trying to be attempted here. But I found a lot of what was written in this final essay to be really thought-provoking. It's called Malay's Speculating Futures, and it's the afterword. And so in it, Bahwari talks about kind of his goals in pulling together the collection and some of his academic reflections, I would say, on, you know, the role of Malays in Singapore, in contributing to culture, to having their voices represented, and kind of what he was trying to do and what he wasn't trying to do in pulling together this collection. So I wanted to share, I don't want to like butcher anything, so I wanted to just share like directly what he writes. So one of the things he says in this afterword around the intention of the anthology, he says, "I've described the first aim of this anthology, which is, if you have not already guessed it, to diversify the genre of Anglophone Singlit, spec-fic, to include an underrepresented minority group whose members have dabbled in the form not just in Bahasa but also in English. For too long, Singapore Malay literature has been operating through these two distinct linguistic spheres. This anthology brings two worlds together into a single text." And then he goes on to describe how he has translated the works that are in Bahasa Melayu into English, not because they are inferior in their original tongue, but because English has emerged as the lingua franca of Singapore, despite the fact that Bahasa is its less widely used national language, a topic for another day. This means that readers who do not read or speak Bahasa can also get to enjoy them. And then he says, "I see this as a first in a series of steps, the next of which will see this anthology in Bahasa, inshallah." I think that is a laudable goal, is to try and bring more Malay fiction into English, because that is just the wider audience. And so inherently, if you're going to try to expand the audience for this type of work, it has to be translated. And I think Bahwari is very self-aware of kind of the trade-off there, because then he also talks about how he wants this to be part of an act of decolonization. And it's just really rife with irony, right? Because like translating this into your colonizer's language, which is English, it's hard to see how that could be an act of decolonization. I do think he's like very aware of this. And probably like two things. One, like baby steps. Any step forward is progress. And he does say he wants to have the anthology in Bahasa as well. And secondly, he speaks directly about how having these representations and these portrayals are in themselves a sort of act of decolonizing the mind. He basically references this Kenyan author, Noguchi wa Tiang-o, who called upon all of us, I guess, to decolonize the mind. And he says that decolonization has been an inspiring concept in his work, but that he's cognizant of the warning by scholars Tuck and Young in their 2012 seminal essay, "Decolonization is Not a Metaphor," that it's just overused, and if you use it too much, you kind of risk diluting its transformative power. When you talk about colonization, there is like real tangible things at stake, namely like land, access to resources, education, heritage, etc. And I also feel that the Singapore context vis-a-vis colonization is pretty unique. I'll never forget in 2019, this was 2 years after I moved here, like all of the bicentennial celebrations celebrating the day that Sir Stamford Raffles came to Singapore and like made this a British colony. So there's definitely a relationship as a colony that Singapore has that's a bit different, or the discourse around it has not been, I mean, it's very varied. I can't really like speak for the entire, every single person in Singapore, but I do think it's safe to say that there's like a different relationship with being a colony and colonization in Singapore than other places in the world. And obviously he's very well aware of this, but his point is that this anthology still is an act of decolonization or attempts to be a reaction or response to colonization in two ways. So the first, I think, is just bringing attention to lesser known aspects of history and heritage. And I do think Singapore has a very tightly drawn narrative of its history that's portrayed by the government and in the education curriculum that sometimes glosses over alternative experiences for the sake of this kind of big man history or this one trend of like third world to first world. So he's saying, I think, by having this anthology, so he says, admits the groundswell skepticism about the glories of British colonialism that have been celebrated in Singapore since independence. It is about time that we bring to attention lesser known aspects of its history and heritage. And then I think there's also a really pernicious trend that probably exists till today, as structural racism always does, but particularly during the colonial era, that brown people are lazy or that Malays are lazy. And there was always this stereotype that the Chinese are more hardworking, et cetera, et cetera. So he says this anthology is also an important symbolic intervention to subvert residues of colonial stereotypes about the Malays as the Malays, one of which is the enduring idea that its members are inferior at science and technology, a myth fueled by racialized official data on education performance. And that is something that does kind of permeate throughout all of the short stories. A lot of them are about, well, so there's a lot of Malay excellence, which is great. There's also, Malays as real human beings. I don't think it's overly focused on that, but a lot of the characters are scientists or in futuristic high-tech worlds, or they're a detective using like AI technology. And so I do think that's what he's referring to in talking about this embrace of science and technology throughout this anthology. And then the final thing I think he is trying to do is, I think that this happens for a lot of minority groups or groups that have historically faced oppression, which is a lot of the artwork around that group's experience, even that they produce themselves, can be quite focused on trauma or pain or nostalgia almost even. I don't think that's a bad thing, and I think everyone is making art for different reasons, and I also think there's like waves of evolution as we like grow and mature, and a lot of times like initial works are just about shock or about bringing awareness. And then I do think like nowadays in this very self-aware, identity-driven cultural landscape, there's a really big push to just write what you want to write or make whatever art you want to make and not feel so defined by your background or your identity. But one thing that Bahwari is talking about this anthology doing is that it is also challenging the perception that Malay literary writing is perpetually lamenting lost places and tradition in the forms of displacement and nostalgia, though these themes are certainly present in some of the stories here. Again, I feel like this editor has to pack so many really deep concepts into like 5 pages of an afterword, so I hope I'm not misrepresenting what he's saying. I kind of feel like it's almost too ambitious to pack all of this in to such a short afterword, and I do feel that there's almost like a loss of meaning because he's not really afforded the space to unpack it. But I hope I'm picking up what he's putting down. The last thing that he talks about that I think is interesting in this afterword is just how the genre of speculative fiction in itself can be freeing. And I guess insofar as speculative fiction is defined here, so basically he references the entry on speculative fiction from the Oxford Research Encyclopedia of Literature. This was issued in 2017, and apparently spec fic constitutes not so much a genre, but I quote, a form of storytelling expressed through multiple formats: print, stage, film, computer games, hypertext, and hybrids of these that do not participate in the process of mimicking reality. In its brazen rejection of facts and empirical reality, spec fic helps us to rewire our minds and sensibilities to other modes of thinking and interpretation beyond the Western, post-Enlightenment, androcentric, and colonialist mindset thrusted upon us, argues Ojewicz, which is the researcher who wrote this entry. So again, there's like a lot there. I think basically what Bahwari is saying is that insofar as like speculative fiction is really about harnessing the power of the imagination and imagining things for yourself or for people in your community that historically have not been true, it can be very freeing, and that in many ways literary fiction is racist, literary fiction is sexist. It all comes from a tradition that is informed by reality, and that is the reality that we live in. And I get where he's coming from. It's just a lot to pack into a few pages, and I feel like I'm making leaps and bounds by like making these assertions, but I think I'm picking up what he's putting down. And I think essentially he really wants this anthology to be in many ways something that challenges the status quo, challenges how we approach fiction, short stories, and then also challenges the stereotypes or assumptions about what we can expect to get from Malay authors. So does he succeed in doing all of that in this anthology? Next, I'm going to talk about the short stories themselves. And I feel like the foreword and the afterword really were projecting a very ambitious project that maybe falls a little bit flat just because of, I think there's like a wide range in quality among the stories, and they almost feel a bit forced, and they're also pretty short. So I think in general, maybe this is a personal preference, but I just feel that in the same way that the literary analysis and critical thinking that's being done about this project was almost too much to just be condensed into a little foreword and afterword. Similarly, a lot of these stories I feel like grab onto one big idea but do not have enough page space or enough word count to really do it justice. Okay, so now I want to talk about the stories themselves. And the four themes or groupings are Specters of Sihir, which means magic, Tech Baru, which means new tech, Smart Mamat City. I don't know what Mamat means. I tried to Google it, and I'm not sure exactly the context. And then finally, Family Nuclear. In each of these groupings, there are like 3 or 4 different short stories. And some of them I enjoyed, but some of them, as I said before, are just not very well fleshed out. I think in general, I'm very on board with the whole idea of consuming the art from groups of people that are not my own background, and just in general, like uplifting different points of view and different voices. So, I mean, I think that's a given, but if we're just talking about like from pure entertainment value and artistic value, I think some of these were hits and some of these were misses. From the first section, Specters of Sihir, we have 3 stories: Beginning, Transgression, and Prayers from a Guitar. And actually, I think this anthology like started out really well and then kind of went down a cliff, because I really enjoyed Beginning, which is a retelling of the Islamic myth of creation, and I really enjoyed Transgression. I think Transgression was a short story that really incorporated some paranormal or almost mythical qualities while still being a story about loss and grief. It really did that well. And I also liked the third story in this section called Prayers from a Guitar. But then I feel like where I wasn't really as bought into some of the short stories is when they had these very like almost dystopian sci-fi portrayals of the future. And it's really interesting. I would love to talk to someone about this or do a video on it or just think about it more, but especially in Singapore, because it's been a one-party state for so long, and because the government tech is very efficient and highly evolved here. There's also like CCTV everywhere. A lot of these stories that incorporate tech in a future timeline are all about like surveillance or accumulating enough points so that you can access social services or be rewarded for doing good deeds. A lot of them had this idea of points and being like accumulating points as like a citizen in society. There's also a short story, which was my least favorite, I'm sorry, called The Chip, which was just like too far-fetched and not fully fleshed out for me to enjoy at all. But basically everyone's implanted with a chip, and then aliens come. That story was really one where I started to like lose faith almost in the anthology, just because it was so, how to say, it was so like, yeah, it was almost like a comic. It was like very surface level, and it just didn't really gel, I feel like, with the overall tone of the rest of the anthology. So I think Tech Baru, Smart Mamat City, and Family Nuclear had a lot of stories that incorporated AI, that incorporated dystopian visions of what the future would look like as a Malay Singaporean. So that was pretty cool. I think like the concept is cool, but none of the stories like really hit the nail on the head for me. I think some standouts though. I really liked Tuju by Nazry Bahwari, who edited the anthology. I don't think I got it, but I do think the world building was really good and the characters were very intriguing. I was kind of confused what was happening a lot of the story, but I'll just blame it on myself, not on him. And then I think it would be a really good premise for like a novel or to expand upon. And then I also like the story Second Shadow by Norida Kamari. And this, I think, was successful in combining the concept of surveillance and living in a dystopian society without it being really heavy-handed. So the second shadow is actually someone tailing our main character because he has been a little bit too vocal in his political views. Yeah, so I think it's just a little bit all over the place. And I also think with this kind of collection, it's maybe better to read one every month. Like, it's not maybe fair to the collection to read it all in 1 week or 1 month or whatever I did. And I did kind of know that I tried to like consume it more slowly, but the stories are so short that like I guess I could have just read 2 at a time, but I kind of just ripped through it. In terms of the last of my critiques, so I didn't realize that there was a glossary until I got to the end of the book, and nowhere throughout the book are there footnotes. So I think this is just a really interesting question. I don't think there's like a right or wrongs, and I would love to like hear people's thoughts on this, or even Nazry's thoughts if I ever get to meet him, because I feel like there's a lot of different artistic and academic choices to be made here. But I kind of felt like, okay, so on the one hand, it's not great to assume everything is made for me. So if I don't know what a Malay word is, like I should look it up, or I should have I've lived in Singapore long enough that like I should be able to pick up all of the like Bahasa Melayu that's in this book and all of the terms. But on the other hand, he himself acknowledges that this is meant to make these works more mainstream and to bring them to an English-speaking audience. So I feel like the footnotes and the translations could have been a lot more accessible. I didn't know there was a glossary, and I read the Kindle version, so that's my bad. I think if I had the paperback version, I would have like checked the back, but there's no indication when you're starting the book that there's going to be a glossary. And then there's things that are not in the glossary. So for example, I'm still trying to figure out what tuan means, Malay tuan, like Tuan. So if anyone knows, let me know. And the other thing I'll say is for stories that are so short already, it really does kind of bring you out of the experience of reading when you have to Google. And I will just say, like, in the world that we live in today, every time I check my phone is a potential like distraction vector for me to just like go on social media. So when I'm reading, I really try to not touch my phone and get the dopamine hit that's just gonna suck me in. And I would prefer to just like be with the work rather than having to leave it to Google things. But I do think some of these stories, it's not like feasible. Like you need to Google stuff in order to understand what's going on. So I don't know if that's a good or bad thing. I feel like it's just an artistic choice, and you know, not everything is made for me, and not everything is made for like a foreigner or like a non-Singaporean or even like a non-Malay Singaporean to understand. But I do feel like given that one of his stated intentions is to bring this work to a larger audience, there were some tweaks that he definitely could have made to improve like the reading flow and the reading experience. It's not like a real critique. I feel like this is a very difficult thing to do. I know that the like the essays and the short stories. Maybe they're more essays than short stories. Maybe I shouldn't be calling them short stories, but I know that essays were like published at different times and in different languages, and he did a lot of the translating himself. And there are sometimes footnotes. It's just not really that consistent across like what they decide to translate and what they don't. And I was proud of myself for knowing some things. I do feel like I've improved my like knowledge and my awareness of like Malay Singaporean culture and like even Islam and a lot of the things that they refer to. I do know what they're talking about, but of course, like I'm just not going to get everything, and maybe that's okay, but I do think it does affect like the reading experience overall. Okay, I want to end on a positive note, and that is the cover. The cover is so sick, and to me, like such an amazing representation of most creative, meaningful, symbolic piece of art. Like to me, like the cover almost accomplishes the goal of imagining like a really rich and new future for Malay Singaporeans while also harkening back to the past more than the stories themselves. I don't know, not to be dramatic. But basically, I read about the cover design, which was done by Muhammad Izdi. And he, in the description says, the illustration is based on the concept of Gunugan, separated into 7 realms. And then from the top, you have the realm of the gods, then the realm of the cosmos, which is angels, aliens, sentient beings. Number 3 would be realm before man, so jungle, trees, flora, and fauna. Realm of technological invasion, so the tree's roots are made up of cable and wires, which form traditional Malay ornaments. The realm of the living, the realm of spirits, and the realm of the undead. And for each of these 7 parts, Muhammad actually like draws connections to different either like events or characters from short stories in this anthology. So I just thought that was so cool. Like you have the CCTV surveillance from Tek Baru, you have the guitar from Prayers from a Guitar, that short story. Then you have these ghosts down here. Yeah, I don't know. I'm such a fan of the cover, which was not really to be expected. But yeah, I'll just end with a big caveat, which is I'm definitely not an expert in Malay fiction or in the experience of Malay Singaporeans, obviously, and I'm just open and learning and an avid reader. So if you come from that background and you have any thoughts, I would definitely welcome them. And just in general, if you've read this, let me know what you thought. I definitely enjoyed some of the stories, not all of them, but overall enjoyed the experience of reading this, and especially just like those nuggets of really heavy topics, especially in the afterword, you know, like decolonizing the mind, what it means to be a Malay Singaporean writer today, whether you write in Melayu or in English, like all of these really, really deep topics, which were just kind of like rushed through in the afterword. I think I would love to like spend more time and read more and hear more from experts about each of those. So in that way, it was a really nice teaser, and I do recommend checking out Singa-Pura-Pura.